Welcome to the final session of the Family History Show Online 2022. I'm joined by our experts who will be introducing shortly, along with their best tips to aid you in your research. I'd just like to thank you all firstly for joining us today and making this online show another success. Now, firstly, I'll introduce myself. I'm Mark Bailey, and I develop tools online to help people research their family history and break down brick walls. And I'll be chairing the expert panel today. Our first expert is Nick Barrett. He's an author, a historian, and is probably best known for his work on the BBC Who Do You Think You Are TV programme. Would you like to introduce yourself, Nick? And have you got a tip you'd like to share with our audience?
Thanks, Mark. I'm a little bit out of date on the Who Do You Think You Are. It's been a few years since I worked on the show, but my love of genealogy has not left me in all this time. I suppose it's not really a tip. It's more advice about the sort of characteristic you're going to need, particularly as you've exhausted all of the really easy stuff, birth, marriage, death, census, parish registers. I've found tackling my own knotty problems in my background, you need determination, resilience, obduracy, and a never say die attitude. Keep chipping away at those problems. You never know when new data sets appear online, but you also have to think like your ancestors, particularly the really elusive ones who move around a bit. So, you just have to keep on going at it, I guess.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And next up, we have Jackie DePell, a family history tutor and speaker. Jackie, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, and have you got a tip you'd like to share with our viewers?
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much. Well, I've started doing family history when I moved into my grandparents' house, which was full of memorabilia and still is over 100 years later. That's then led to a career change opportunity. The Open University, the WEA, all led me to doing this second career, which is fabulous. What would I say? Well, I would say, like Nick, never give up. But I'd also say work on the elimination option rather than, people say, which is my ancestor? Turn it on its head and say, which isn't? And then tighten that net, and then maybe you can come up with the answer.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you, Jackie. And we're welcoming back Mia Bennett to our expert panel. She's a census detective and DNA expert for the Society of Genealogists. Mia, have you got a really good tip you'd like to share with us all?
Yeah, and it's kind of it links both DNA and kind of more traditional research, but it's don't go in assuming you know the answer. Always keep an open mind and be ready for finding something you don't expect. And when you see something that doesn't feel right, it might not be. So go and investigate it. Use those tips from Jackie and Nick. Definitely go hunt, eliminate, find, and the reward that you get when you solve the problem is worth the effort.
Excellent. Thank you, Mia. And last but not least, we have Debbie Kennett, our expert in DNA and surname research. Debbie, would you like to introduce yourself and let us have your best tip?
Yes, so I've been researching my family history now for over 20 years, and I had a particular interest in my maiden name, Cruws, spelled Cruwys. And as a result of that interest in that surname, I was an early adopter of DNA testing and set up a DNA project for my surname as well. So my tip is actually partly comes out of my surname research, and that is to always think of alternative spellings for your surname. And with looking at the surname Cruws, I've ended up with a whole variety of weird and wonderful mistranscriptions in all sorts of records. And what I find is people are usually there in the records, but they're hiding under different spellings that you hadn't anticipated. So I've found, Cruws is listed under the name Omps, for example, beginning with O, and all sorts of different initial letters. So I actually keep a list of all the misspellings that I find in the different censuses, and then when a new record set comes out, I can then look again through all those misspellings to try and find people, because it seems to be the same mistakes are made over and over again. So a C might be mistranscribed as a G, or a T is often mistranscribed as an S. More often than not, when you can't find a record, the reason is that the name is misspelt.
Yes, that's a very good tip there, Debbie. Yeah. Knowing the same issue with my name, Bailey, you can spell a whole variety of different names would be spelt the same. Right, so let's get started with our questions and see what we've got first today. So the first question we've got today is a DNA question. So for you, Debbie, this comes from Wendy, who asks, I have two men who have the same big Y value, but they do not match on the 111 STR markers. They do match on 12 STR markers. Can you explain why they only match on the 12? So there's probably some terms we should begin by explaining. Debbie?
Right, yes. I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. So when you get a big Y test, you've got various ways of looking at the results. And the easiest way is to look at what's called the block tree, where it shows your position on the big Y tree. Now, the big Y test isn't, just to explain to everyone, it's a very advanced test which sequences about half of the Y chromosome. So if you're comparing two men who have both taken the big Y test, it will give you a very good idea of how closely they are related based on the number of markers or SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that they share. Now, normally with the big Y test, you get on the block tree, you will also see a list of your private variants, and it would actually be quite rare for two people to match on to actually not have any private variants of their own. So it may be that the person is not actually looking at the complete set of results, and that they do actually have some private variants that are showing up that will distinguish between the two men. And you would normally count those private variants, and it's about 83 years for each variant that you sort of allow when you're trying to go back in time. But the STR markers that we started off using in the very early years of DNA testing from the year 2000 onwards, they're only covering literally 12 markers, whereas there are nearly 60 million positions in the whole Y chromosome. So it's only a very small fraction, and we are learning that when you only look at those STR markers, sometimes they do give a misleading indication of genetic relatedness. So you should always go on the SNP testing rather than the STR markers if you have both sets of data available. And there certainly have been some cases where we are seeing people who do have these matches on the big Y test but don't match on the STRs. So it's the big Y testing which is giving you the most accurate answer. The problem with the STRs is that sometimes particularly if you're from a population where everyone's sort of fairly closely related, say in Ireland or Scotland, a lot of men trace back to a common ancestor fairly recently, they have very similar Y DNA signatures with those STR markers, but the SNPs on the big Y test will help to sort people out.
Great, thank you, Debbie. And our next question is from Keith, who is hoping to find a birth registration in France. He asks, I have no experience on how to go about obtaining official documents from abroad, and he'd appreciate some positive direction on how to get this carried out. Jackie, perhaps you could shed some light on this one.
Yes, love to. Well, there is just one that I know of anyway, dedicated French Family History Society, which not society, website, which is Philae, if that's how you say it, FILAE.com. And they are gradually putting birth, marriage and death and other records online. Other ideas might be MyHeritage, which I do know has quite a lot of French records. Use also the card catalogue on Ancestry. They're more likely to have records for France perhaps than Find My Past, but do use their all record sets. Just check it out. Go to the National Library or Archive of any overseas country. They often have got information on doing family history. It's such a popular thing. They're bound to have been asked before. There's another website called Cindy's List. Again, go through that by country to France and see what's there. I was interested at the piano tuner comment, because one of my family history students has got a piano tuner that's gone to Canada and then comes back. So interesting maybe on that. Of course, then maybe look for a dedicated researcher, somebody who specialises in researching in France, because they may save you lots and lots of time, even though they may charge, obviously, that would be natural enough. They are the specialists, they will do it for you and not waste your money, all being well. In the terms of time, I mean.
Brilliant. Yep, thank you, Jackie. And I've got a very interesting one for you here, Mia. They say in 1919, a married woman from Essex gave birth to a baby boy in the Lambeth Workhouse Infirmary. But the baby's father was named as a married man with whom she was having an affair and with whom she lived with for the remainder of her life. But the baby's not with her in the 1921 census, and no other reference to the baby has been found. Might he have died shortly after birth and the death not recorded, or might he have been given away to another family? Over to you, Mia.
Yeah, and just quickly before I go on to that, just from the previous question, the Paris archives, if you've got French, are actually all online, and you can see all the tables of birth, marriage and deaths. If you Google Paris archives, you actually find a lot of that is online and freely available.
That's a handy tip.
So moving on to this question. So the two possibilities that you've said are there. It's unlikely that a death would not have been recorded in around 1919, but the potential to be given away is possible. Another possibility is that the surname that is being used can be different. So you need to look in those different options, both the mother's surname, her maiden name, and the baby's father's name. So you've got 3 different surnames to think about in any of the searches that you're making. In terms of could the baby have been given away, it's before the time of formal adoptions, so it would have been an informal adoption, potentially with families, but there were different kind of ways people went about trying to have a child adopted. If someone has this person, if the baby did survive and it was adopted out, there might be someone who descends from them who's searching for the unknown grandparents or great grandparents. And so it may well be worth doing a DNA test if you are related to either the married woman or the baby's father, as a way of potentially making contact with the family. Because if they are searching for this unknown child, it would be a very good link. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas of where else to look.
Great, thank you, Mia. DNA often helps break down some brick walls like that. So yeah, very handy tool to the modern genealogist. I've got another interesting question here, so maybe you can help with this one, Nick. Is there a way to find out about my wife's grandfather, who was a German national and was interned during the First World War? Nick?
Now, if you'd have asked me this a few years ago, I wouldn't have had a clue. But picking up on the point you made about DNA, I've subsequently found that my illegitimate grandmother had a German father. So I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years investigating German ancestry. Now, in this particular case, there are a few places that you can start. So we're talking about internment, but let's just jump back a few years. You might be able to pick up some information from the 1911 or 1901 census, which often record not just the country of birth, but sometimes the region or the place. And that might allow you to go back and have a look at some of the records that are held in Germany. I'll come back to that point. The German population in the UK was very, very large, actually, compared to other alien nationalities. Alien being a term for people born outside of the UK without UK citizenship. But as we get closer to the conflict, there was also a lot of anti-German sentiment whipped up by publications and newspapers. And as the war broke, there were some hastily passed resolutions and restrictions, which really curtailed the movement of many German nationals and also their spouses. And this is where you start to get internment picking up, particularly after 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania. There were riots and attacks on German establishments, particularly baker shops, patisseries, people in service, that sort of thing. So internment really stepped up from 1915 onwards. Throughout the year, 19,000 people started off being interned. That rose to 32,000. So lots of people were locked up. Unfortunately, there aren't that many records. There are far more for the Second World War with personnel cards than there are for the First World War. You might find some lists of people who were in the various internment camps, some on the Isle of Man, others around parts of the UK. And a lot of these have been collected by the Home Office with a few sample records in the War Office. Most of these are now on Find My Past. And if you want to look around the edges, you'll find some similar research guidance at the National Archives. After the war, the situation continued that German nationals were often asked to leave by forcible deportment or had to register at police stations. So you might well find some records if it's London based and Metropolitan Police. So you'll find some files there moving forward. So many German nationals lost their freedom and probably left the country. So you might want to look at the 1921 census to see whether they are still there. Now, going back to the thread of how you search their German ancestry, there are some records on many of the platforms that we know, Ancestry, Find My Past, Family Search also. So you might want to go there, but quite a lot of these records are not online. So like me, you're probably going to need to hire a researcher out in the region or the town where your ancestor came from. And that's where the records can be sometimes problematic. There is another issue here in that you don't find any German genealogy based on DNA. And it's only people who leave Germany who then take the test, because it has been locked down and is banned or prohibited for genealogical purposes in Germany. So it isn't as straightforward. You have to really hope that there's something in the 1901 or 1911 census. Hope that helps.
Great. Thank you, Nick. That actually brings us on to a handy tip. Would you recommend a particular place to look if you're after a local researcher, especially if it's international, outside the country? I know there's several organisations that can help locally in the UK, but is there anything more interesting in Europe or further afield?
Yeah, we've already heard about Cindy's List, which not only gives you access to many of the researchers working in each area, but also many of the online and offline resources as well. The Association of Professional Genealogists, which has regional links all over the world. You should be able to find some people there. That's how I got hold of my German researcher, who has revealed far more about my ancestry than I ever dared dream about. So they can do some incredible work, but of course it comes at a cost.
Great, thank you, Nick. It's probably worth pointing out that AGRA, the Association of Genealogists and Researchers and Archives, are at the event today. So if you are interested in finding out more about the work they do, or would like to inquire about some research services, please feel free to visit their stall. So our next question comes from Elaine, who is looking for records in Scotland. And she'd like to know where you can go when local archives, library services and online websites can't take you any further with research. This is likely something that all of our experts have had experience with in the past at some point or another. So perhaps you could start us off with your tips, Debbie.
Right, so the obvious answer to this is to consider using DNA testing as a way of connecting with other people who are descended from these people. And I would always recommend starting now with Ancestry DNA, who have a database of over 20 million people. And you would hope that by taking a DNA test, you might be connected with descendants of those people that you are researching, who may have additional information that you don't already have. And another way of connecting with people is just to actually search online trees that are available. Those trees may not be very accurate for the earlier generations, but they're usually very accurate for the more recent generations. And also, I would suggest trying to connect with local researchers who have that specialist local knowledge. And one of the best ways of doing this now is if you're on Facebook. There's a whole network of all sorts of specialist genealogy groups on Facebook. And a lady called Catherine Wilson actually has a long listing of Facebook groups on genealogy Facebook groups. And I have actually got the link in my handout for my talk today.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. So if you would interested in downloading that handout, if you visit the lecture theatre and click on Debbie's talk, you'll be able to see the handout linked below the talk video. And Nick, do you have anything you'd recommend on top of this?
Yes, I think building on that idea of seeking specialist help, you can look for family and local history societies, or possibly one name studies who focus on some of the clan names that you're looking for. But of course, again, Debbie's point about DNA is really relevant. You might find that they don't appear in any of the local records because they didn't originate in Scotland. They might have come across from Ireland or possibly parts of Scandinavia or even England. So you might need to cast the net a little bit wider and look outside of those direct data sets.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. Again, looking at One Name Studies, the Guild of One Name Studies is also here at the show today. So if you were interested in finding out more about your particular surname, I'd really recommend going into the exhibit hall and finding the Guild of One Name Studies. Jackie, do you have anything you can add?
Well, I can only really endorse what my colleagues have said because they've got all the main points there. Just following up on the idea of one name studies, there are of course people with the one place studies, and they're not always broadly advertised or registered. It is going back and exhausting everything on the local patch, newspapers and all that sort of thing. I'm just really thinking outside the box and getting to know the local area.
Thank you, Jackie. And then Mia, finally, is there anything you'd like to put on top of this?
I think just picking up on something that Nick said about looking at local history societies rather than family history societies. There are a lot of groups that are based on history, whether it's a local history society, a local archaeological society. They do a lot of work with memorial inscriptions, but also think, is there a museum locally that might have local information? Is there a university that has done any academic studies for the area? It's amazing when you start looking into these other type of places that have records and archives, that there's a lot more information that's available through these more unusual sources.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mia. I think all of these tips are really good, not just for researching in Scotland, but wherever you're searching, when you hit a brick wall. These are all good techniques to help you overcome those walls when you literally can't find any of the records online or through the local archive services. So I hope that helps you, Elaine. Our next question is for Jackie. Sue wants to know if there are any records kept when a person changes their name by deed poll and how she should access these records from 1936 to 1944. Jackie, do you have any ideas?
Right, well, obviously if they do it by a deed poll, which is a public declaration, then the Gazette should record this, as well as anglicisation of names. But of course, people don't always do that, so they could possibly put a notice in a local newspaper. It's a bit far-fetched, but somebody might do a statutory declaration in front of a solicitor, so that is just lodged with them. It'd be a needle in a haystack to try and find that. Other things, maybe family traditions. Is there any knowledge of this thing from there? Sometimes a will, but again, you've got to cast your net. We're looking at a date range where wills are inexpensive. So sometimes somebody identifies a natural child or also known as in a will. Criminal records, of course, are really good if you've got anybody as a criminal or associated because of that alias idea. So unless there's a formal deed poll, which would be in the Gazette, free to search online, you're really having to think round it, I think, unless my colleagues have any other ideas.
Great. And I think it's worth pointing out there is also a change of names database on the genealogist. So I'd give that a quick look if you have a subscription to the genealogist. But yeah, so does anyone else have any other recommendations for change of names databases?
You just reminded me of change of name, that the Western Front Association have done a lot of work on aliases in the First World War because of the picking up from pension records.
Thank you, Jackie. Well, next up we have a question from Jenny about migration. So perhaps you could help with this one, Nick. She asks, I've noticed that passengers migrating to South Australia from the UK in the 1800s were assigned a registration number. Do those registrations documents still survive? And if so, where are they stored? What do you think, Nick?
Well, the 1800s is a very broad period. If we're talking about passenger lists, that narrows it down to 1890 and beyond. So I'm also going to make some assumptions about the terms of passage. And I'm assuming here we're looking at a free settler rather than a convict. And of course, their experience was very different. So let's assume, which is always dangerous, that we're talking free settlers here. And Ancestry has a database of nearly 9 million free settlers to New South Wales, covering 1826 to 1922. So you might find some further details there, and you can pick up a lot of information about immigration on the National Archives of Australia. Looking for records in the UK, there are various ways someone might have gone across as a free settler, either paid for their own passage or possibly accompanying a convict. But quite a lot could have come across at their own free will or were part of a parish scheme. And from the 1830s and 40s in particular, many parishes paid the passage for people to go to Australia because it was cheaper than maintaining them via the poor rate. So there are a number of sources you can have a look at. There's a really good research guide at the National Archives which summarises these. Quite a lot of material in the Colonial Office, because back in the 1800s, Australia was treated as a colony before it moved to a federal government from 1900-1901 onwards. So have a look at some of the Colonial Office registers. You might find correspondence about people applying for passage or being granted passage. You will also find some records, as I said, at the National Archives of Australia. And again, there's a very extensive set of guides showing you how people would have applied for citizenship, some of the census records that were kept, which may show you where someone started from and where they ended up. So you're probably going to have to focus quite a lot of your attention on the Australian side to get those sorts of answers.
Thank you very much, Nick. I've got another question here for Debbie. Helen asks, if someone's surname was Baker, then I assume this came from their ancestors being a baker. However, where would a common surname like Williams come from? Over to you, Debbie.
Okay, so there are essentially 4 different types of surnames, and this is something I'm covering in my talk on the joy of surnames. So we have occupational surnames like Baker, based on the person's occupation. We have locational surnames based where someone the name is based on the place where the person originated. We have nicknames, and we also have patronymic surnames. Now, Williams is a patronymic surname, and it's based on a system that was particularly common in Wales, where the person was named after their father. And if you go back in some of the early Welsh records, people would sometimes have this long string of names that would recount their history. So that it may be John, son of William, son of Thomas, and so on, going back for many, many generations. But when surnames came into being, then this is when that name William would have been adopted as a surname. So it meant that William would have been the father of would be the father's name. So it could have been John, son of William, would have become John Williams, the Williams being short for William's son. If you look at particularly in the north of England, you have got the Scandinavian influence, and you would have a similar version of the name, and there it would be Williamson. And sometimes the S gets dropped, so a surname like Thomas might be the surname, or it could just be, say, in some cases, it could just be William as the surname. But I'm covering this in much more detail in my talk. And what is fascinating is if you do a distribution, do some mapping of a surname, you will see that each surname has its own distribution pattern. And I just did a quick search for Williams, and it's very, very predominantly a Welsh surname, as might be expected, because patronymic surnames are very, very common in Wales. But there's also quite a heavy concentration in London, which of course is a reflection of migration.
Great, thank you very much, Debbie. And as Debbie said, this is all covered in more detail in her talk, which is available in the lecture theatre, not only today, but also for the next 72 hours. So don't worry, you've got plenty of time to watch that. Next up, we have a question from Alan in New Zealand, who is trying to trace his wife's uncle on the 1939 register. And he's been told that he was an evacuee to Otley in West Yorkshire, where he was said to have lived with 2 unnamed spinsters. So I guess one of the potentials here is that his record is still closed if he's under 100 years in 2022. But what do you think, Mia, would be the next step he could take?
Yeah, so I think the chances are that we've got the date of birth here as 1928. So, and if he didn't die in the UK or has a name that could get there could be more than one person with that date of birth and that date. When the death gets registered, Find My Past may not pick up that death and release the record. So basically, any record where someone was born less than 100 years ago is redacted, and so you wouldn't find them. If it has been released, there could be a number of different reasons why you can't find it. I have seen mistranscription errors. I've seen errors in the enumerator actually writing the information down. My grandmother's date of birth is wrong. It's the 7th rather than the 17th of January. So you might need to think about a slightly wider. The other thing, if they were evacuated, there is a potential that their surname wasn't given, but the people they were evacuated to, their surname given. And if you don't know that surname, that obviously makes it a lot harder. I have in the past searched on an exact birth date with just the first name, get rid of the surname in the search and the place or anything like that, and just try and search just on the date of birth. But the chances are in this case, it is one that has not been released yet. You could try communicating with Find My Past with the information of his death, and they may be able to find him to release that record.
Thank you, Mia. Jackie, do you have anything to add from a local perspective, obviously being from West Yorkshire yourself?
Yeah, I do, because my friends are volunteers at the Otley Village Museum, and I know they've done a lot of work into the refugees moving into that area. So they have a website. I'd thoroughly recommend contacting them, because a lot of people will give them records and information rather than let them go into the council archive service. You also mentioned civic societies. That my local civic society has done lots of MIs and things like that, but not just for the refugees. Also local newspapers, and there's a specific book about the Great Exodus, the evacuation of Leeds school children, which might shed light on the pattern. And that's a gentleman called Roy C. And it's Boyd, but it's B-O-U-D. So that's a dedicated book on the locality, and which is what we've all said, you need to get down to grassroots.
Fantastic. It's always good to have some local knowledge. Yeah, thank you, Jackie. And on to our last question of the day. One visitor has asked, how do you find BMD records, or birth, marriage and death records, that are not on genealogy websites? I guess that could be far and wide ranging, whether it's before civil registration or records from British nationals abroad, or, well, let's start with our experts and ask each one of you. I'm sure you've all got different advice on this. So Nick, perhaps you could start us off.
Well, firstly, there's the earth-shattering revelation that not everything is online. My goodness, what did we do before the internet? Well, I'll tell you what we did. We would go to the local archives in the region where the person was likely to have lived. So work back from census, and usually you will find the place where they claim to have been born or baptized. And you will find quite a lot of those parish registers still there, because not all of them have been transcribed or digitized. So my top tip here is go local, go back to the old-fashioned way of doing it, and you might need to look through some microfilm or ask for some parish registers to be produced for you. But that is the way you should be able to find some of that information.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. It always feels like you get a sense of accomplishment when you find the old traditional records, and in the traditional way, where it takes you a day or so to find one person's birth, marriage, death record, rather than finding it instantly on the screen.
Well, look, I'm a medieval historian, and that is the way we used to do stuff. So ploughing through lists of names till you find the right one. It's both therapeutic, and you also, this is a really important point, you also get a sense of the pattern of life in that area. You're not just homing in on the one name in isolation online. You're actually seeing other branches of the family, other patterns that you may well see in later marriage records. You get a sense of the local community, and that is so important. So it's not just about finding the name, it's putting it back into its local and historical context, which in its own right will unlock a whole range of other records that aren't online. So, you know, in all seriousness, it's so important to go and visit many of these archives to get that local exposure that you don't get necessarily doing it online.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. And Debbie, what tips could you offer on this?
Right, so I've got two tips. So first of all, even if the records are available online, it may be that they are not properly indexed. So there are now large numbers of parish registers that you can browse online on Family Search or on Ancestry or elsewhere, which may not have been transcribed or indexed, or if they have been transcribed and indexed, I found the transcriptions on Ancestry is absolutely appalling for many of those early parish registers. So if you are interested in a particular parish, you can actually do that process that we used to do in the record offices of going through page by page in the parish registers, looking for your families and trying to collect the family groups. But another useful source, particularly if you're looking for living people, I find, is Facebook and other social media websites. So if you're trying to track people down, you can't find a marriage on FreeBMD, for example, you may well find that the people have got, they've got Facebook accounts, and quite often it turns out that they've married in, say, the Caribbean or somewhere. And people, all when there's a new member of the family, there's always a lot of people have public Facebook accounts, and they've got pictures of all the family members, and you've got the date of birth on there. So and you can also go to websites like sort of LinkedIn, where people often provide information. The Companies House website, if you're looking for people on there, the company directors have to give their name of birth, their date of birth, and also if you look at electoral registers, you will often get you'll be able to pinpoint someone's age from the electoral registers, or get an approximation of their age from there.
Fantastic, thank you, Debbie. So I think it's worth pointing out at this stage that there's plenty of organisations out there to help you with whatever brick wall you've come to, whether it's national organisations such as the Society of Genealogists, the Association of Genealogists and Researchers in Archives, the Institute of Heraldic and Genealogical Studies, and the Guild of One Name Studies are all attending today and in the exhibitor hall. So don't forget, if you have got a brick wall you can't find any help with elsewhere, or even just a family history, the local family history society is also available. So go to the exhibitor hall, get their contact details, or even if they're available on live chat still at this point in time, go and just ask the question. If you're interested, if you have an interesting family history story, it's also worth sending it into a magazine. Obviously you get the privilege of having it published in the magazine, but also it can often help other readers can find your story interesting and see that it's actually tied into their family history too, and connect you with people you hadn't realised were also your relatives. So Andrew Chapman is the editor of Discover Your Ancestors magazine, who are exhibiting in the exhibitor hall today. So it's, again, worth popping over to them and to give them a quick contact. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I'd just like to thank each one of our experts one last time. You can find out more about Nick Barrett on his website, nickbarrett.co.uk, and the STIX research agency, which he runs, at sra-uk.com. And you can find Nick on Twitter at FamilyHistorySH. Mia is part of the census detectives at the Society of Genealogists, and she's also now doing DNA analysis. You can find out more about Mia at her website, miagenealogy.com. You can find out more about Jackie on her website, yourfairladies.co.uk, and you can keep up with Debbie Kennett on her blog at cruise.blogspot.com and on Twitter. If you want to see any more talks by our experts, you can watch them all on the new website Family History TV. Simply go to www.family-history.tv to find out more. And that website has not only the talks from today, but all of our previous online shows. So there's a wealth of information and talks available for you to watch there. So thanks again to all of our experts, our exhibitors today, our sponsors and our partners, and of course all of you who attended the Family History Show online today. Remember, this panel and all the other lectures from today are available to watch for 72 hours. And keep an eye on our website, thefamilyhistoryshow.com, for details of our next show. And we hope to see you all in June in New York. Thank you very much for coming and watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.